And now, God, open my mouth so that I can speak. Open our ears so that we can hear, and open our hearts so that we can change by your power and through your grace. Amen. Please be seated. I've shared before that when I was a kid, I was bullied a lot. Most of it happened at school, and at that time, it wasn't something you got a lot of support for, and I certainly didn't come home and talk about it. In retrospect, that probably wasn't a good plan on my part, but that's a conversation for another day. However, from time to time, it would happen closer to home, on our street or around the corner, in places that made it harder for me to hide from my dad that it was happening, because he would hear it or see it happening, or someone, usually my sister, would tell him. On those occasions, I remember my dad walking me over to the home of the offender, talking to one or both of the parents, and then after getting a clearly coerced apology from said bully, making me shake the hand of the kid that just pushed me around as some sort of peace accord between us. Are you kidding? I didn't like it. I didn't trust it. It felt weak, and I couldn't believe that my dad was making me do it. I remember imagining what it would be like to turn the tables, to be the one that someone else was afraid of, because I had the power. I sat down earlier this week and read today's gospel passage, and those memories flooded back. I suppose many of us have had moments where we thought of responding to someone else's hate, rage, or abuse of power with anything other than vengeance, and that just seemed ludicrous. And as usual, Jesus has something to say about that. Today we hear the continuation of the Sermon on the Plain. We pick up today exactly where we left off last week. No gap, no scene change, no skipped beat. We must engage Jesus today, carrying all of what we discussed last week. Otherwise, his words today may leave us feeling confused, and even perhaps like he's just asking too much of us. Let's remember the setting. Jesus has come down from the mountain with his apostles, and a great crowd of disciples, and all manner of other people from all Judea and Jerusalem and the coast of Tyre and Sidon are there. This is important to our understanding because Jesus addresses what we hear today to all you that listen. This teaching is big, and it's intended for all who are willing to hear it, regardless of who they are or where they come from. This is especially important when you consider that relations between the people of Judea and Jerusalem and the people of Tyre and Sidon were complex, to say the least. When Jesus talks about loving enemies, it was very likely that there were people there listening to him that hated other people that were there listening to him. He's not being theoretical. He is asking them to look around at each other and consider what he's saying. As I contemplated that, I found myself thinking about Nelson Mandela. Many of you know that he was a South African anti-apartheid activist and politician who served as the first president of South Africa to be elected in a fully representative democratic election. He was the country's first black head of state. He spent his life focused on dismantling the legacy of apartheid by bringing about racial reconciliation. Prior to his election, Mandela served 27 years in prison as a result of his activism. In spite of facing years of discrimination and imprisonment, Mr. Mandela found a way not to hate his captors, the people he saw face to face every day. He found a way not to hate those who sought to have him imprisoned. He found a way not to hate those who relied on and, more importantly, supported a system that was designed to keep him and people like him down. He's often quoted as saying, "No one is born hating another person because of the color of his skin or his background or his religion. People must learn to hate." And if people can learn to hate, they can be taught to love. For love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposite. I believe that's what Jesus is getting at with his words today in the light of what we heard last week. As we engaged those words, I shared my belief that Jesus wants us to see with the eyes of our hearts. In order to do that, our hearts must be open and softened rather than closed off and rigid. When we allow hate to take root in our hearts, it changes us. See, hate corrodes from the inside. It makes us suspicious. When hate is given residence in our hearts, it makes it easy to believe that someone who is different from us is an enemy simply because they are different, before we ever consider that they might be our sibling in God's one human family. Furthermore, Jesus cautions us from being transactional in our relationships by highlighting that even those on the wrong path will do things for others in a quid pro quo fashion. Notice that he doesn't say, "Do to others so that they will treat you the way you want to be treated." Not at all. He calls the community of gathered listeners on that plane, he calls them all to treat others the way they want to be treated, which is something entirely different. It meant leading with that behavior and not waiting to see what someone else does first. It meant leading with the heart, with love. And it's important to highlight that he's actually speaking to a whole community of people. The work of not letting hate take hold is to be engaged together in community. No one has to go it alone. Speaking of community, I was on a Zoom with some clergy colleagues this past week, and we were all kind of lamenting the complexity of this particular reading at this particular moment in the life of our nation. We all shared a common recognition that for many of us, especially our trans and asylum-seeking siblings, the concept of loving our enemies seems impossible to contend with. Still, Jesus comes to us with this call. It would be great if it were only for some, or even better, only for those we think are the real haters, leaving us with no real work to do here. Yet that's our way, and not the way of love that Jesus is calling us to walk. We know this because time and again he will model for them and for us what this looks like lived out. How encounter after encounter, question after calculated question, no matter what trap they set for him, and we know they set them, he will face those who wish to just make him go away without letting hate for those who stand against him begin to motivate his actions. Part of the work of salvation that Jesus does for us through his life and death is to give us an example to follow, knowing that we won't always get it right, but showing us the way so that at least we have a fighting chance. But But let me be clear about something so there can be no confusion. Jesus neither wants nor expects you, or anyone else for that matter, to stay in situations that are unhealthy, where you are abused or diminished. And nothing that Jesus is talking about today has anything to do with accountability for wrongdoing. We can remove ourselves from abusive situations. We can hold the perpetrators of abuse accountable for their actions and still not respond in kind, thus giving hate space in our hearts. Moreover, offering love in the face of hate is an act of resistance. What a hater wants more than anything else is for others to hate too, because it lets them off the hook. It holds them to no standard. In the culture of the day, being slapped on the cheek was considered the ultimate kind of insult and sign of disrespect. When Jesus tells us to offer the other cheek, he's not telling us to ask for more abuse. He's calling us to turn the tables and defy the expectation of retaliation and instead respond with resolve and peace, because that disrupts. And Jesus was a disruptor. That is precisely why he calls us, his disciples, to this way of being. Because it will upend the status quo and change the game. If our hearts cannot be turned cold and hard, then the evil forces of the world cannot win. Hate for hate does not beget love. If we really want cold and hardened hearts to change, we need to ramp up the love, not the hate. Our collect this morning reminded us that without love, whatever we do is worth nothing. That love is the true bond of peace and all virtue. In this challenging time we find ourselves living through, I pray that we will not find ourselves overshadowed and bloated with hate, but rather bursting with love and shining the light of Christ into the world for all to see. We must filter everything we do through the lens of love. Even our responses to those who seek to hold us and or those we love down. We cannot look away from the struggles of those around us as if they don't impact us, because they do. We must see those struggles with the eyes of our hearts. We must organize in love. We must stand in solidarity with the vulnerable and the oppressed in love. We must face the bullies of this world with love. We must be preachers and teachers and bearers of love, because, my friends, the alternative is just too grave to consider.